Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Jenkins. I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. We are a not-for-profit with a mission to empower an Indigenous-led energy transition. I want to thank everybody here for your time. Thank you very much for coming to learn about this report. We're very excited about the release. It's a very timely subject. I'm calling from Bikejunang territory, my home territory of Walpole Island First Nation, Huron-Tract Treaty in the heart of the Great Lakes. You can feel free to ask questions using the chat function during the presentation, and we will also have a dedicated Q&A at the end. Questions can be asked in English, and we can also provide written responses to French questions. So I want to highlight a successful collaboration we've had with the Canadian Climate Institute, working on a Healthy Energy Homes report in 2023 and releasing this report now. So with that, I'd like to hand the mic over to Rick Smith of Canadian Climate Institute.
Thanks very much, James. Really appreciate this, and we really appreciate partnering with Indigenous Clean Energy on this important project. So as James mentions, my name is Rick Smith. I'm the president of the Canadian Climate Institute. We're Canada's leading climate policy research organization, and we believe passionately that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous leadership needs to be at the core of the climate change discussion. And so I'm very proud to work with the leader of our Indigenous research team, Maria Shallard, in trying to move that agenda forward. And so this offering that we're about to brief you on today and have a discussion about today is our latest effort to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is at the core of the climate change discussion in Canada. I can't think of a more important topic than housing at this moment. So I'm really excited to see this research, this work launched into the world, and to give you a taste of it today. So I'm going to hand it over to my hardworking colleague Maria to take it away. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thanks, Rick. Thanks, James, for the welcome. Everyone. My name is Maria. I may have met some of you on the call previously. I'm joining you from unceded Qualicum territory today. I'm of Penelakut, Dutch, German, English, Irish, Welsh ancestry. I didn't grow up in my community. I grew up on Lillooet territory in Mount Currie, and my family comes from the McCallum Sampsons on Chuan, or what is now known as Salt Spring Island. I'm very passionate about this work. I grew up with a family in construction. My dad has worked in construction, and I grew up in housing that had very little insulation and a sock on the drain that would catch sediment, and care deeply about this work, and excited to talk to you about it all today. Dean, could you please share the first slide? And if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to start off by just discussing the Healthy Energy Homes concept, and then my colleague Carlyn is going to talk a little bit about the context, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. This report was meant to amplify a lot of the recommendations of folks that have been working in this space for many, many years, 30, 40 years in Indigenous housing, and amplify the recommendations that have already been put forward alongside the folks that we've met with. And we've introduced a Healthy Energy Homes concept, as James mentioned, in 2023. This is really a policy lens that takes energy efficiency into consideration by proactively investing in housing to be energy efficient, to offset health impacts, that is rooted in climate resiliency and supports long-term well-being of inhabitants. And this concept is a coordinated, holistic, Indigenous-led approach, recognizing that a house is more than four walls, but is important to mental, spiritual, emotional, cultural well-being, and is grounded also in the lands and waters in which that house is built on, and the relationship to the environment. The concept is also about preventative healthcare, so really thinking of housing as healthcare. So healthy energy homes present a huge opportunity. One is in the reduction of healthcare costs. You're going to hear some of my colleagues talking about the impacts of inadequate housing on health a little bit later on, but there's a great opportunity to reduce health costs, and climate change is largely exacerbating inadequate housing conditions. Indigenous communities are 30 times more likely to be impacted by wildfire smoke, and without proper ventilation or ceiling and windows, air cooling technologies, you're much more likely to breathe in high particulate matter, leading to respiratory illness and disease. So there's definitely a benefit here to be had by proactively investing in housing. Also, alignment with reconciliation, the calls for truth and reconciliation to close the health gap that exists, as well as to improve housing, and the commitments to the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People that the federal government has in advancing a nation-to-nation relationship. And there's opportunity to save community members money, especially thinking about some of the community perspectives that we heard throughout this research, where folks are making decisions about whether to heat a home or to buy groceries. And in the scoping report, we talked about these heat or eat trade-offs and the energy poverty that exists across community. And there's also opportunity by proactively investing in housing through energy efficiency measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in off-diesel and remote community. Investment pays off, and I've got to cite Aboriginal Housing Management Association here and raise my hands to them for the great work that they've been doing for so long in this space. This is a figure that shows for every dollar spent, there's $6.79 in saving over the long run, and that is broken down on the side here in this figure. There's benefits to residents, social value from safe and affordable housing, including improved mental health and reduced homelessness, but also government revenue savings, so increased revenue and savings from reduced use of services. And those are some of the reduction of the cumulative impacts on housing on health. So our approach to this work has been really rooted in what we've heard from folks that we've met with, people who are working, I think many of you on this call, at the forefront of Indigenous housing, health, energy efficiency, and climate change. As much as possible, we wanted to amplify perspectives of Indigenous organizations working in this space. So you'll see throughout the report, we worked with National Indigenous Collaborative Center for Housing, Aboriginal Housing Management Association. We met with Métis housing providers, with physicians, with medical chief officers working in the space. And in November last year, we held a virtual gathering where we split into working groups, and this was made up of different folks that were recommended to us to speak with, who are working at the intersections of the space to identify policy barriers and recommendations. And these policy barriers and recommendations have been woven throughout this report and helped to feed into the policy recommendations and findings you're going to hear later on from some of my teammates on this call. As much as possible, we wanted to root this in storytelling and ensure this was done in a good way. Some of the quotes have been translated. Again, there's a commitment to advance reconciliation, and one of those is to advance and support and uplift Indigenous languages. And we conducted a literature review that tried to amplify as many of the research reports as possible that we could find in the intersection of this space as well. One of the reports that I mentioned earlier, Beyond Sustainability, you can see a beautiful illustration by Jana Whale there on the front, is the Power of Indigenous Healthy Energy Homes, and two other reports that are really integral to this work and complement this piece of research, Enabling Efficiency and Energy Foundations. And these were produced by Indigenous Clean Energy and really talk about recommendations based on perceptions, barriers, and needs of Indigenous people, communities, and organizations. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Carlyn to talk a little bit about the context of this report.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlyn Allary. I work as a research associate on the Indigenous research team alongside Maria at the Canadian Climate Institute. I'm originally from Treaty 1 territory from Winnipeg. I'm a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and I currently live in Whistler, BC, on the traditional territories of the Squamish and the Lillooet Nations. And as part of our research, we looked extensively at the current policy landscape and the realities of Indigenous housing and health, providing the foundation for the findings and recommendations that follow. And our research finds that current Indigenous housing policies have resulted in one-size-fits-all housing solutions that are unsafe, overcrowded, culturally inappropriate, energy inefficient, and not adapted to local climates or resilient to climate change impacts. And the reality is that nearly 1 in 6 Indigenous people live in homes needing major repairs. Half of First Nations adults report mold in their homes, and Indigenous people are twice as likely to live in overcrowded housing compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. And inadequate housing conditions contribute to numerous health issues, including higher rates of asthma, respiratory illness, and mental health challenges, just to name a few. And current Indigenous housing policy is costly both in human health, but also in economic terms. And the research is clear, housing is a determinant of health. And yet in practice, housing, health, energy, and climate are still treated in silos, with climate and energy considerations often viewed as add-ons rather than really foundational to solving Indigenous housing and health challenges. There is abundant evidence that inadequate housing directly contributes to poor health outcomes and increases healthcare costs. Yet these health-related costs are rarely considered in housing policy or funding decisions. And so we can take asthma, for example. Asthma risk increases in homes with overcrowding, mold, and poor indoor air quality, conditions that are far more common in Indigenous housing. Asthma has very high direct and indirect costs because of the many hospital visits required, medications, and the cascading mental, physical, and professional impacts that it has. And in Canada, asthma costs are projected to reach $4.2 billion a year by 2033. Improving housing would reduce asthma triggers and symptoms and help lower healthcare costs and strain, which is especially impactful given that asthma prevalence among Indigenous people is roughly 40% higher than among non-Indigenous Canadians. Climate change also magnifies the impacts of inadequate housing. Indigenous people are already disproportionately affected by climate change, and many existing housing challenges, such as poor indoor air quality and mold, will worsen with more frequent wildfires, flooding, and extreme heat. And so, for example, flooding can increase dampness in homes and increase the risk of mold, which can trigger asthma and respiratory infections. And so, despite these connections, communities are often forced to choose between building more units quickly and as cheaply as possible, or building energy efficient, climate resilient homes that do require higher upfront investment. And so this results in homes that are built to insufficient standards, which increases energy costs, leads to poor health outcomes, and leaves communities more vulnerable to climate impacts. And so next slide, please. Thanks, Dean. So despite the urgent need to improve Indigenous housing and health by deploying healthy energy homes, significant institutional barriers do persist. And so first, government accountabilities are fragmented across agencies and jurisdictions. Responsibilities for Indigenous housing, health, energy, and climate are split between multiple federal departments, as well as provinces and territories, municipalities, and Indigenous governments. And this creates silos, overlapping responsibilities, and layers of bureaucracy that make coordinated action really difficult and leave communities struggling to navigate the various programs and access supports and implement holistic solutions. And second, existing funding programs are insufficient, inflexible, and short-term. So funding for Indigenous housing often takes a firefighter approach, meaning patchwork funding that's awarded on a project-by-project basis, which again makes long-term planning and maintenance extremely challenging. Funding is also rigid and often non-stackable, preventing communities from combining sources or pursuing innovative solutions. And even when communities do secure funding, strict rules on how it can be used can force communities to prioritize immediate safety issues over long-term healthy energy home development. And lastly, community capacity restraints constraints remain a persistent reality for many communities. Many funding initiatives require high administrative and technical capacity, but don't provide the support needed to actually meet those requirements. Short application windows and complex reporting rules can place significant strain on staff that are already stretched across competing priorities. Financial capacity is also a major barrier, so gaps between funding and actual project costs can force communities to delay repairs or defer energy efficiency upgrades that require upfront investment. And without resources to cover these additional costs, necessary housing solutions are often out of reach. And I'll now hand it over to my colleague Corey from Indigenous Clean Energy.
Thank you, Carlyn. Yes, my name is Corey Cote. I am from Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe in Quebec, currently calling in from my home territory still here in Ottawa. I am the Director of Energy Efficiency with Indigenous Clean Energy. I've been overseeing the housing-focused programs at ICE, working on these programs for over 5 years. So I'm going to introduce some of our findings and recommendations. These are largely based on what we've seen from our work, and it's clear that there are many challenges and barriers to healthy Indigenous housing. Taking into account the current Indigenous housing context and various institutional barriers identified, we've developed our findings and policy recommendations. So next slide, please, Dean. Thank you. So our findings can be summarized as follows. So healthy homes are fundamental to Indigenous health, well-being, and self-determination. Homes that are climate resilient, energy efficient, culturally appropriate, support the long-term well-being and resiliency of occupants, which ultimately improves health outcomes, lowers healthcare and energy costs, and advances reconciliation. Our research also demonstrates that current government approaches remain fragmented and fail to empower Indigenous leadership in developing healthy energy homes, which ultimately costs lives and resources. And finally, holistic housing approaches that consider health, energy, and climate, as well as approaches that are rooted in shared accountability, flexible funding, and capacity development, will deliver the most sustainable and equitable outcomes for all. And so, please, next slide. Thank you. So that brings us to our proposed solution. And our report recommends that governments in Canada develop Indigenous housing policy around 3 core pillars, that being energy efficiency, climate resiliency, and overall well-being. Firstly, we need increased coordination across governments. Fragmented responsibilities have created silos, duplications, and gaps. And integrated action across health, housing, energy, and climate is essential for supporting healthy Indigenous housing. Secondly, governments should shift from short-term inflexible funding towards long-term investments in healthy energy homes. That means flexible funding models, including innovative financing solutions that give Indigenous communities the ability to decide how best to achieve their desired outcomes. Third, housing policies and programs must be co-developed with Indigenous leadership. Indigenous governments, organizations, and communities know what will work in their own contexts and realities, and policy needs to reflect those realities. Fourthly, governments should recognize and measure co-benefits of healthy energy homes, and especially with health improvements and emission reductions. These are benefits that are significant, and integrating them into policy design and evaluation will lead to smarter housing decisions and programs. And finally, governments must invest in building community capacity. That means supporting the skills, the training, administrative structures, and financial tools that will allow communities to plan and implement and sustain healthy energy homes over the long term. Strong capacity is essential for ingraining these measures to be long lasting and for self-determined outcomes. So I'll stop there and I'll throw it to my colleague Kayla Fayant to expand on these recommendations and speak about how they can look in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So, as he mentioned, I'm Kayla Fayant. I am the Energy Efficiency Projects Manager on the Bringing It Home team at Indigenous Clean Energy. I've been at Indigenous Clean Energy about 3 years and working on this project a couple of years with Canadian Climate Institute. I am joining today from my home community, which is Fishing Lake Métis Settlement in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. So, if we could go to the next slide, Dean. We'll start with recommendation 1, just to coordinate and integrate government action. So, federal, provincial, and territorial governments and their agencies should create explicit coordination mechanisms with Indigenous governments to integrate policy frameworks, reduce duplication, streamline access to resources, and reallocate existing funding to support shared goals and benefits. So, in practice, this would entail developing a single window approach, one point of contact that would reduce bureaucratic barriers and administrative burdens on Indigenous communities, improve access to funding and support for healthy energy homes, while also better allocating the resources available to support the development of Indigenous-led solutions. Additionally, we recommend striking an interdepartmental working group between the main government agencies involved at the federal level and Indigenous organizational representation. So in this report, we identify and name 7 different government agencies, of which includes Indigenous Services Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, just to name a couple on that list. So we think this working group should take a collaborative approach to addressing housing challenges and implement a distinctions-based strategy and develop and work with an Indigenous Advisory Council that includes representation from First Nations, Inuit, Métis rights holders, as well as Indigenous communities without reserved lands and urban Indigenous populations. So for recommendation 2, it's to co-develop policies and programs with Indigenous leadership. So federal, provincial, and territorial governments and their agencies must co-design policies and programs with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis leadership to ensure cultural relevance and regional adaptability. Co-development strengthens trust, enables tailored solutions, and reflects the principles of self-determination. So again, in practice, this means developing an approach to ensure all government agencies and programs are accountable for taking a distinctions-based approach and co-developing a guiding document on best practices for federal, provincial, and territorial departments and their agencies working on healthy energy homes with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. Also supporting training in ethical space, Indigenous cultural safety, and anti-racism for all non-Indigenous professionals working on healthy energy homes in Indigenous communities, including government employees, healthcare providers, housing practitioners, and external contractor associations to improve trauma-informed practice. Also working to co-create funding programs and initiatives to support the delivery of healthy energy homes with the Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations, including the communities without reserved lands and urban Indigenous communities, and updating building code standards to reflect energy efficiency, health, climate resilience, and Indigenous values. So to recommendation 3. Committing to long-term investment agreements. So federal, provincial, and territorial government should commit to multi-year funding agreements with Indigenous rights holders. Stable commitments enable long-term planning, the construction of new healthy energy homes, upgrades and retrofits to existing housing, and investment in health measures such as indoor air quality monitoring. In practice, so governments should replace firefighting and piecemeal approaches with secure and reliable funding for integrated solutions addressing issues related to Indigenous health, energy, and housing. This means investing in and prioritizing long-term commitments and agreements co-created with the Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations to address housing needs using trauma-informed practices. And collaborating with Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations to map out phased approaches to long-term funding agreements to allow for more consistent and tailored support through each phase of an initiative. I'll now pass it on to Carlyn to take on the next recommendations. Thanks.
Thanks, Kayla. So our fourth recommendation is to provide flexible funding options, and that is federal, provincial, and territorial governments and their agencies should offer a range of funding models that allow Indigenous communities to select the approach most suited to their goals and their capacity, and whether that's traditional funding, blended finance, outcomes-based agreements, or community-led mechanisms. And so in practice, government should create a range of funding program options, including creating open-ended funding programs that support Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations in identifying needs, exploring project options, and determining desired outcomes. Also creating funding programs with increased flexibility in how funds can be spent on housing and energy-related projects, and creating funding programs specific to pre-planning activities that support recipients in preparing for more shovel-ready project funds, and also exploring innovative finance models, such as initiatives that increase home ownership on reserve or support outcomes-based funding models. Recommendation 5 is to measure the holistic benefits and impacts of housing. So specifically, federal, provincial, and territorial governments and their agencies should ensure that reporting requirements for housing projects capture social, cultural, environmental, and economic impacts, and not just project outputs. And that's all while upholding Indigenous data sovereignty. And this approach supports evidence-based decision-making, ensures future funding is better aligned with real outcomes, and reflects the lived experiences of communities. And though in practice, government should enable Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations to identify their own metrics of success and report on them in ways that are aligned with their own protocols and ways of knowing. And so this could include metrics like reduction in hospital visits, improvements in well-being, or energy savings. Government should co-develop evaluation frameworks with Indigenous rights holders from the outset to track metrics, impacts, and progress. And lastly, to draw on global examples, such as those seen in New Zealand and Ireland, to holistically measure the impacts of healthy energy homes. And the intention of this is to recognize the role of housing as a social determinant of health and the benefits to well-being that do stem from healthy energy homes. And I'll hand it back to you, Maria.
Thanks, Carlyn. Our final recommendation is to ensure funding programs are accessible and capacity responsive. Application and reporting processes should be simplified and support training, skill building, and job creation to ensure communities can fully benefit from the opportunities available. In practice, this means approaching Indigenous communities to identify their needs and connect them with appropriate agencies or resources. Complementing this report, we're putting out a directory, and the directory has different programs that exist for across provinces and territories as a way of supporting where information lies. In practice, it also means building on accessible program models like radon testing or library lending programs. Right now, there is a new program where radon testing devices can be rented from a library or checked out, and this could be expanded upon. When we're considering energy efficiency measures, it's important to make sure that radon gas isn't trapped in houses when the building envelope is more secure. And so taking that holistic approach is really important in the recommendations that we put forward. And then also finally integrating funding specific to capacity building initiatives in all funding allocations. So hopefully you've all gotten a sense of what's in the report and have a chance to read over it. If you're a part of it, we really just want to say thank you and raise our hands to you. We really believe that improving housing is reconciliation and action, and safe, healthy, and culturally responsive housing is central to fulfilling Canada's commitments to truth and reconciliation and the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People, closing both the health and housing gap. And that healthy energy homes is a great conceptual policy approach for an effective way forward. By implementing these recommendations, we think governments have an opportunity to support Indigenous communities in building homes that are energy efficient, climate resilient, and support overall well-being. And the creation of Build Canada Homes is an opportunity to get Indigenous housing right. So just end there and pass it to Dean Evangelou, who is our Manager of External Affairs, who's going to take any questions, and we welcome them from all of you and hope we can have a great discussion. Heichka, thanks.